What are they doing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks. It's a beautiful day in San Francisco, and I don't know how it is over in Brooklyn there, David. How's the weather?
It's cloudy and getting colder, but we did have a freakish 60-degree weather day yesterday, so that was nice.
Yeah, I feel sorry for my relatives in Chicago.
Oh my!
Yeah. Well, we're really pleased today to have on our show Jaime Kucinskas. I hope I pronounced that right. And she's the author of a new book that just came out, The Mindful Elite, Mobilizing from the Inside Out, published by Oxford University Press. So welcome, Jaime.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we met a couple summers back in Naples, Italy at the European Group for Organizational Studies conference. We had a track on critical corporate mindfulness, and that's when I first discovered your work. That was before you published the book, and were you were still working on your dissertation at that time, or?
I just finished it, but I was getting the book on paper. So yeah, that was a wonderful meeting and a great group of people, and it helped me think through the book in a deeper way. So yeah, it was really helpful.
Is this book based on your dissertation? Is this?
It is, yeah.
Oh, it's great. It's not easy to convert as many of people know, to convert a thesis into a book.
No, it's a beast. In fact, I'm working on my next book, and it's so much more fun and easier.
Right.
Starting from scratch as a book.
Oh, can you say what it is, what you're going to be working on?
Sure. So I'm in Washington, D.C. right now interviewing federal civil servants about their responses to the new leadership under the Trump administration. So totally different topic.
That's going to be a bestseller.
We'll see. It's a darker picture than, well, I guess if you read the news, you wouldn't be surprised, but yeah, it's about morality. So it's got some similar threads.
There's such a thing as morality left in Washington? That's good.
That's the question. It's a rare few, but I'll be finding those people. So
fantastic. Wow. Well, so maybe we could start right off the bat by how did you? What got you interested in wanting to study the mindfulness movement, and maybe talk us a little bit about your study and how that all came about.
Sure. So I was living in Bloomington, Indiana, where I was getting my sociology PhD, and there was a bunch of different factors that I think contributed to it. So one was that Bloomington has this amazing Tibetan Buddhist center. The Dalai Lama's brother actually had a position at Indiana University and opened up this amazing temple. And I was curious about it. And in sociology, there's very few people who actually study Buddhism. So I knew it was an area that I potentially would want to do work in. So I started going to this temple to learn more about Buddhism. And there was just amazing teachers that came through, and they kept talking about mind and life and going to these scientific conferences, and all these lay practitioners, people who know nothing about academia or science, they were talking about this psychological research. And as a sociologist, I thought that was really weird because nobody ever reads our research. So for all these people at this obscure temple in Indiana to be talking about psychological research being done in Wisconsin, I started to wonder, where is this coming from? Is it any good? Who's behind this? How did this happen? So I started following the thread. And about 2012, Tubden Chodron came by, and she actually, she's a nun out west. Actually, I think she's in Washington State. But she had known Adam Engel, who was one of the founders of the Mind and Life Institute. Mm-hmm. And so she connected me with him and basically shot me into the middle of the organization behind bringing Buddhism into science. So
yeah, Mind and Life Institute.
So that's where I started.
Mm-hmm. Oh, mm-hmm. I see. Yeah. And so you were sort of like an ethnographer sitting in on different organizations, and besides Minded Life, you were at other organizations, right?
Yeah, so it wasn't, I'd say, more of an interviewer than an ethnographer. I traveled around the country for about a year, driving from center to center, doing interviews with whoever would talk with me, and spending some time at different centers, going to some of the conferences, the Mind and Life conferences, Wisdom 2.0, Zen in the Brain at Joan Halifax's center. So I went to a bunch of different conferences and workshops and things like that. Talking to pretty much whoever was, working at these core centers that would speak with me.
And part of your discovery of this mindful elite was, from what you said in the book, is that every time you went somewhere, you would often see the same group, the same elite.
Yeah, so that was something that took me by surprise is, I'm embarking on this journey across the country. I had no plan for the year except for to follow the thread and go see whoever people referred me to next. And then I realized that I wasn't special or unique, that there were a lot of people that were traveling around the country doing the same thing. And there's a lot of people, entrepreneurs interested in creating mindful businesses. The scientists were talking to all the same people. It turned out to be this really dense network of people flying around the country and talking about mindfulness and contemplative practice more broadly, and science and how to move it into new institutions. So yeah, I was just jumping on the bandwagon, it turned out.
Mm-hmm. And your book begins, it leads off, I remember this meeting when it happened, with the American Enterprise Institute and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Why did you choose that to lead your book off with, and what's significant about that meeting, symbolically perhaps?
Okay, so as a sociologist, one of the things that we want to study is, with culture, there's multiple layers of culture, right? So there's the culture that we see and we use to talk to people, but there's also things that people take for granted and they can't see. And one way you can study these taken for granted parts of culture is through social ruptures. And so for the Mind and Life Institute, the AEI event, so what happened, the background story is, in February of 2014, Mind and Life and the Dalai Lama attended an event. It was a series of sessions at the American Enterprise Institute. And to give you kind of a sense of what these sessions were like, the first one was called Moral Free Enterprise. So,
and the AEI, sorry, is a right-wing think tank, basically, right?
It is. It's a neoliberal think tank promoting, free trade, little government intervention,
right, deregulation,
deregulation. So after talking for a year with people coming at, mindfulness and contemplative practice, mostly from a science background, I was really surprised. I mean, the people I'd been meeting with struck me as, coming right out of the counterculture. These are people, a lot of whom had been meditating since the 1970s. They were much more politically liberal on average. So, it came as a shock to see that here they are on stage front and center with the American Enterprise Institute. And I wasn't the only one that was surprised. The media coverage lambasted the event. Mind and Life didn't respond. And then it turned out that a lot of the longtime members of Mind and Life were really upset about it. And later that year, I met with one of the early members of Mind and Life, a really, really wonderful, highly respected scientist. And he told me over coffee that the event was really terrible and that it gave them the sense internally that something that had been wrong had been made manifest, and that Mind and Life had gotten taken by the event. It seemed like a form of, symbolic capture. And so that raised a lot of questions of, how did they get here? How did these people coming out of the counterculture who want to make a difference and make society better end up on a stage seeming like they're supporting, a lack of government services for the social problems that they care about? So there's a lot of paradoxes there. So I thought it would be a great way to just kind of open the book as kind of raising some questions for people about a topic that most people think about mindfulness. They think about, some single white person meditating in the woods in this peaceful, calm state. And so this example was meant early on to show a different face of it.
Right, and it's interesting that this kind of reminds me of what Sean Fiat called saffron washing, just like greenwashing with the environmental movement. It kind of reminds me of that because it sounds like they co-opted the Dalai Lama because we all know that he's expressed himself as being a Marxist. And it seems like the AEI kind of spun the story afterwards, right? Wasn't that part of it, that there was some like spin going on afterwards?
Yeah, and so what happened was AEI pretty much, they control the story. So if you looked at their website after the event, the way they portrayed it was that, look, now the Dalai Lama thinks, free trade and free enterprise is great, and he realizes his errors. And when you look back over the different accounts from different people at the event, it turns out that's not really the story. The Dalai Lama is still a Marxist.
Right. I got a book about that. I got a book I haven't read on that. Yeah. Why the Dalai Lama is Marxist. Or socialist, I think is the title. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I've never met the Dalai Lama, but the reporting on the event made it look like he was manipulated.
Yeah. And so one of the things that you say early on in the book, which I found interesting, you say, I found that as an elite movement, contemplative mobilization was a chimera. Can you say more about this?
Right? Is that it? Chimera?
Sure. So yeah, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it, if it's chimera or chimera.
I'm probably not pronouncing it right. Yeah.
But anyway, regardless, so there's two meanings to that word. One is from Greek mythology, and it's a fire-breathing monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. So it's this admixture of different animals. And that was the meaning that I invoked when I wrote it. But there's actually a second meaning to the word, which turned out, I think, to be applicable as well. And the second meaning is something that's hoped for or wished for, but in fact is illusory or impossible to achieve.
Yeah, that's the meaning that I saw.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's kind of a myth. There's a paper dragon or paper tiger, whatever.
Mm-hmm. It turns out I think both meanings kind of get at the mindfulness movement. But I guess thinking more about what is this admixture? What is this a case of? So as a sociologist, one of the things I've been thinking through for years is, like, what is this a bigger example of? Is it a social movement? Is it a cultural movement? Is it just cultural diffusion? What's going on here? So, and that's been debated internally in the movement. It's been talked about also among scholars. Within the movement, it's interesting because I've heard some of the same people call it a movement in some contexts and not in others, based strategically on who they're talking to and what they think would sound appealing. Other people don't think too much about it. But as a scholar, when you compare it to definitions of a social movement, I end up calling it a movement because there's this dense network of people and organizations who are working together to promote the cause of mindfulness and spreading it, because they're seeking to bring in a new set of values into powerful institutions. Mm-hmm. And also because they're operating not just like within a school, but they're operating across institutions. So they're outside of, in part at least, outside of major institutions. So that's a base, pretty bare bones definition of a movement. When you get into the more complicated definitions of social movements, some people will argue that they need to be more radical, that they need to have some protest, they need to have some disruptive action. So that's where it's like it is, but it isn't. But then there's also a strand of movements that come out of the 1960s and 70s that are more about changing individuals and transforming them. So the mindfulness movement is more along those lines. So yeah, it was kind of one of those things where in the book, what I wanted to do is just familiarize people with these different ways of looking at it. So, they could in some ways draw out what they thought it was. But I mean, in the end, I think it's this kind of like transformative we say alterative, scholars say alterative, this movement that seeks to transform people in their mindsets and values. So it's this cultural movement.
Uh-huh.
We're reading it really as well. It's what you said. I mean, it's you you often allow the reader to draw their conclusions, but you do say it's a kind of movement from the inside out. Generally, it's not a kind of that much of a marginalized or alienated movement, and it is these elites that are working within very powerful established institutions, and that it is very individualistic. The idea was that if each individual uh, practices or subscribes to this, then there will be some kind of change.
Yeah, and so that's also that's another important component, and that's that's where the title of the book comes from, is that this is not your social movement of people who are marginalized, who are coming together to empower themselves against powerful institutions. So these are people who already are established, who have social credibility and social power, access to resources, credibility. They have really affluent networks, and they come together to work through the organizations they already have access to. So it's a different way of mobilizing.
Right. Quite different than the civil rights movement, for example. Yeah. So you sat down early on with, I think he was the executive director of Mind and Life Institute, Adam Engel.
Hmm.
And so what did you make of that meeting? I mean, that was kind of an early story that you tell in chapter 1.
Yeah, so Adam was one of the early people that I met with, and I've met with him a few times, and I mean, he comes off as really energetic. He's got an activist mindset, and I think this distinguishes him from some, and perhaps from many people in the movement.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, he in the 1960s and 70s was reading broadly about spirituality and was influenced um, by meditation, but also by Sufism. Like he does yoga, so he's got this, broader contemplative background. Um, and he was an entrepreneur, so he started the Mind and Life Dialogues, like thinking, this would be a great entrepreneurial endeavor. He could try to bring the Dalai Lama together with scientists and hold a series of dialogues, and that was really where it started. And then it developed over the years into something bigger.
Right, and one of the things that I picked up on in your interview with him is the idealism that the mindfulness movement will, basically change the world and save the world. I mean, it's a very almost messianic message.
Yes, yeah.
Did you pick up on that?
I did, and that was one of the interesting things about it is, here you're teaching people in these intervention programs. So, it went from the Buddhism and the science and a few isolated programs into developing into, this more of a movement to create these so-called intervention programs where they created classes on mindfulness, programming on mindfulness that they moved into a lot of institutions in higher education and science and healthcare and the military and prisons all over the place. And so I think that, yeah, they thought by teaching people to meditate that it would first change their mind and their attitudes, and that would enable them to have more intelligent dialogues with other people, which then would give American society more tools to engage in really more complicated collective problems.
Mm-hmm.
But what I saw in 2012, and I think what you're picking up on is kind of there's a gap there between, what they're saying they're doing and what they're actually doing. So they're saying, this is this great practice. It's going to change you. It's going to change your interactions. It's going to change the world. But when you look, what you mostly see is people, sitting and working on themselves. And oftentimes they're doing it through groups. So it could change their interactions and it might reverberate in their immediate lives. But then the lingering question is, well, what about those larger problems?
The
and I think
institutions, right, in the social structure.
Exactly. And as a sociologist, or as scholars, I think, we think about, we have the privilege to sit back, and think about it a lot more. And I think that they haven't thought about that as deeply.
No, and most people don't. And what I appreciate about your work is that you are a sociologist. What I tell my students when we describe some of these this kind of behavior, it's almost as if these people never took sociology 101.
They
And
probably didn't.
you know, if they did, they were on their cell phones or asleep or something. But your title seems to stem from C. Wright Mills, from the power elite, and uh, later on you talk about how there's a lack of sociological imagination, which is another C. Wright Mills uh, trope, and that's what strikes me so much, that people they don't see that there's a level of analysis at an institutional or societal level. It's everything is all individualistic, and what Ron and I see is that reinforces a neoliberal American enterprise kind of mentality.
I mean, I think that that's true. I think it's true in broader American society outside of the movement too. So
Yes,
it's kind of like we're swimming in this culture,
yes,
and they're focusing on their own cognitive patterns, but without real, I think, sufficient training in the larger structures that we're a part of. And just to give a little background for people who are listening, because I know I take it for granted that people know what a sociological imagination is, but
Uh-huh.
after teaching for a couple of years, you realize that nobody else knows what I'm talking about with that.
Yeah.
So, so just a little background on C. Wright Mills. The sociological imagination is learning about the broader world that you're a part of. So learning about the institutions, learning about broader society to figure out like where your story, where your biography fits in the larger society and the larger trajectory of history that you're living in. And the idea is that by learning about that, you realize that what you think are your individual problems are actually deeper social problems, and they're
right,
much more complicated.
right.
Right.
Well,
Um,
and that other people share them too.
Exactly, and that's the whole thing. And when other people share them, you realize, okay, this is a system that's benefiting some people and not others. And that's where it gets at that, capitalist kind of system that we're in. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that one of the things with the mindfulness movement is it started with a lot of people interested in psychology,
Right.
and spirituality and religion. And so psychologists focus on individuals
Right.
and mind states, and religious people often tend to focus on spiritual growth internally, and they don't tend to think more about the systems that are they can't see every day. So I think that there was this kind of, and that's what in the book, I know Ron wanted to talk about this later too, but there is this sense of myopia, where they're focused so much on the details of what's around them that sometimes I think they do miss the bigger picture.
Right.
Yeah.
And talking about C. Wright Mills, I think I don't know if this is a quote. It's from memory. It's something like connecting personal troubles with public issues is part of
Yeah.
the challenge of developing the sociological imagination. But yeah, I think one thing that comes through pretty clearly is that everyone has an implicit theory of change, and I think their theory of change is that a change at the individual level will automatically lead to changes at the political level or at the socio-political levels. But I find that quite hard to believe, given that you're depending on individual level interventions, and their biomedical paradigm is somehow going to magically lead to a cultural transformation. That to me is like there's a big gap there.
And more than that,
Yeah.
it's the individual elites, it's
Oh
the
yeah,
leaders
I forgot about that.
then it's like trickle down economics, which is a myth. It's going to infect or infuse or transform the corporations or the military or
Right.
education and so on. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
and you spent some time at the Center for Mindfulness in Massachusetts.
So yeah, so I spent a lot of time in California. I spent some time there as well. Um, Judd Brewer, I met early on in the process. I interviewed him the first year, and when he went to the Center for Mindfulness, he helped me get access.
Uh-huh.
They wouldn't talk to me before that. Um, So I did. I got the opportunity to spend a couple weeks there.
Oh, nice. And so you mentioned in the book that you requested it. You requested an interview with Jon Kabat-Zinn, but that was a no-go.
I hounded him. I asked him multiple times. So obviously, studying mindfulness movement, you'd want to talk to Jon Kabat-Zinn.
Yeah.
But he always gave me ambiguous answers, and he never followed through when I emailed him.
Well, that's not surprising.
I tried my best, but
yeah, but he was mindfully ambiguous.
So anyway, needless to say,
Yeah.
I was lucky in the end. He's done so many interviews and public talks,
Right.
so I've seen him speak multiple times. He's written a great deal about the history of the center.
Right.
There was another sociologist where he did multiple interviews with her about his work and his philosophy. So there's tons of material on him. So unlike a lot of other people I spoke with, I didn't have a problem.
Did they give you access to their archives there?
No. So Mind and Life did.
Uh-huh.
But the Center for Mindfulness didn't. But I did interview a bunch of people while I was there.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And you met with Saki Santorelli, right? He's now the new director.
I did. I bothered him too.
Okay. So what was your impression of him, just in general, in terms of his perspective?
So Kabat-Zinn and Santorelli were interesting for me because, I already told you, my background started in Tibetan Buddhism. So I found their take really different and perplexing sometimes, for some of the reasons that I think you've alluded to, where what they said didn't always make sense to me. Sometimes they spoke in seemingly contradictory statements. In some ways, I found Saki a lot of fun because he's really unusual to talk to, because he's got this like poetic kind of metaphorical style, which is really different. So it's just a different way of interacting. But yeah, I could see how it seems hard to pin down what they're really saying, when the conversation's kind of going all over the place.
I somehow, I don't know, I think Rhonda would agree. We don't think that's accidental. They don't really have much of an analysis, sociological analysis, or the real world in certain ways. So that's interesting to find out about.
They both seem like charismatic leaders. Yeah,
Right.
they have. And what was surprising, actually, the first time I heard Jon Kabat-Zinn speak, I was in San Francisco, and he gave a pretty large talk. And I was sitting in this auditorium, and there's hundreds of people there. And it was clear that he hadn't really scripted his speech that much. So he's kind of ad-libbing, and I was kind of looking around and everybody was just captivated. And I just didn't really understand.
Right.
And that was one of my early experiences with it.
Bit of a hero worship cult kind of thing. But you mentioned a paper which I never heard of called the White Paper. That Jon Kabat-Zinn wrote in 1994. I wasn't aware of that. And was that almost like a strategic planning paper of some kind? Like, this is how we're going to conquer the world with mindfulness?
It was. And, this is one of the things that made me think, okay, this isn't just diffusion, this is a movement. Because the paper was produced for the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society's working group in 1994, so right when it was getting going. And on the board at the time, or in this working group, were leaders of organizations that would come to be, the key players in the mindfulness movement. So Francisco Varela and Joan Halifax, who were early leaders at Mind and Life, were part of this working group. Mirabai Bush, obviously, as the leader of Center for Contemplative Mind, was part of the effort. And Jon Kabat-Zinn. So there you have, three of the biggest organizations in the field. So they all must have talked about it and seen this report. And pretty much in this report, Jon Kabat-Zinn lays out exactly the way the movement unfolded. So this is the strongest piece of evidence that I have that they had early strategy.
They had big
on
ambitions.
how they were going to roll this out.
Yeah,
they did. And
mm-hmm.
Exactly, yeah. So what they wanted to do is exactly what happened where, they wanted different people to take mindfulness, make it their own, move it into different institutions and adapt it as they saw fit. They didn't want it to be like a religious movement with a key leader. They wanted it to be more diffused. And they wanted a number of different national centers that were embedded in powerful institutions like in healthcare and in schools and in universities and companies, and that's what happened. So
And,
it
Yeah.
was pretty amazing to find that document. And what's surprising to me is Mirabai Bush is the only person, she's mentioned it to me repeatedly, but nobody else has talked about it. And perhaps that's because Francisco Varela is no longer living. And actually Joan Halifax, I didn't get an interview with her either. But yeah, so I was surprised that nobody seemed to be aware of this report.
Yeah, yeah,
they knew. I mean, again, as one of your points about being an elite was that they had a lot of, and they have a lot of, social capital, cultural capital.
and real
They're
real
well,
capital too.
and real capital, which is, and so they're well connected.
Yeah, and you saw that with the way the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society was developed. So, early on in their working group, there was a Rockefeller that was in the group. Um, so I know you want to talk about Monsanto, but one of the reasons that they ended up going into that company was because their CEO was in the working group.
Wow.
Um, so and there was moneyed interest and philanthropic interest, behind the organization from the get-go, which is really different than a lot of small organizations, trying to make their mark on a social problem or, you know, so.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really important point: is that nailing it down as an elite movement, which you did beautifully in the book. I mean, the evidence is obvious and very solid. But there's something to be said about, there's something to be questioned about having elites in control of social change. One of the books that I'm starting to read is Winners Take All, which is a fantastic book. Also a study of how elites are taking over the philanthropic movement so they can actually control the agenda. And so anyway, that's a sidebar. But getting back to Monsanto, I have a real... I don't have any sympathy. I don't have any sympathy for Monsanto. I don't care what you tell me. But I think one of the challenges is that these people are very sincere and nice in what they're trying to do. I mean, their intentions are good. They're good people. Yes, we don't disagree with that, but so what? The issue is not whether they're nice or sincere. The issue is what is actually going on, and are you open to looking at it? And so I actually found your interview with Mirabai Bush a little different than some of the other ones in the book. She seemed a little more forthcoming and honest about the limitations of corporate mindfulness. What did you pick up on that?
Yeah, so Mirabai was fascinating to me for a lot of reasons. So she was an activist before she started the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. So the interesting thing about her work with Monsanto is that she'd spent years working in Guatemala with indigenous populations who were, deeply affected and hurt by Monsanto. So she didn't come into this, from a business background where she wouldn't, really be as sensitized to these things. So when she had the opportunity to work with Monsanto, she really fretted over it, and she thought they were awful. Her friends thought they were awful, and she went back and forth, and finally the working group convinced her that it would be a great opportunity. And I think what makes her such an interesting case study is that she's one of those people who, she has a long-standing, deep practice. She was at Goenka's early teachings in India in the 1970s. She's meditated a really long time. She's a very devoted spiritual person, and that was evident to me in going to her home, where she had She had a statue of Hanuman. She spoke about, her teachers and how deeply they affected her and how she wanted to be as a human being. She wanted to be very compassionate. She took the Bodhisattva vows. So she's someone who has these rich backgrounds. Um, and I really liked her, I'll just put that
Right.
out there. And I wanted to show that in the book. But what you see is that the people that she spends time with deeply shape the way that she sees the world. And so you see her perspective changing
Right.
over time as she spends time with different groups of people. And so the Monsanto case is fascinating in that in spending time with, these scientists and CEOs, she became much more empathetic with them. She started to see the world through their perspective. And so her way of justifying working with them was that she thought that, Bob Shapiro, who was her friend, the CEO, when he took it over, he had all of these grand ideas about how he could change the company and he could make it better. And so ultimately, I think she was convinced to join because she thought this was this golden moment where she could come in, work with the C-suite, and he gave her great access. This was actually one of the more in-depth trainings I heard about, where she brought in an insight meditation teacher. They had, a several-day deep retreat with the corporate executives at Monsanto. She invested a lot of time into developing the program. They had follow-up talks. They had support so that employees could go to a Dharma center. And then Shapiro ended up leaving, I think probably realizing that he wasn't going to be able to have the impact that he wanted. And the mindfulness program was totally scrapped. And that was super disheartening for her. So yeah, it's interesting in how her perspective changes, but also that in the end, and this is something that won't be surprising to business scholars or people who study economics, like Robert Reich, for example, talks about how given, the broader landscape of how capitalism works, it basically like boards put so much pressure on companies for quarterly earnings that, at the end of the day, these side projects and philanthropic, social responsibility programs often fall by the wayside. And that's what happened there.
Right. Well, I worked for a very nefarious company when I was a graduate student. I had a paid internship at Exxon Chemicals, and I was involved in organizational development. It was very idealistic, values-driven sort of approach to organizational change. We thought we were going to change organizations to make them more humane and ecologically sound and all that good stuff. And, I work with these scientists too. I remember this one scientist was a benzene chemist. So he was developing this carcinogenic molecules for the petrochemical industry, and he was always suffering from headaches. I always found that quite interesting. I don't know if it was because he was around benzene, but I felt like there was almost like some sort of cognitive dissonance in him, and like he knew he was developing things that were toxic, but I guess where I'm going with this is that in some respects you mentioned that Mirabai Bush, got to know these scientists and all that. But, the larger institutional structures and forces, yes, these are good people. Nobody's debating that. But that is not, using, individual level mindfulness training is not going to change these institutional structures. And I just can't believe they're that politically naive about it. I mean, I'm just going on a rant right now, but...
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, and this is, your Huffington Post piece raises a lot of these questions, and I think your critiques, they're very valid in a lot of ways, where I think that, and this is something I think that's human nature, right? I think that she's not alone, and that's what's so captivating about the story, is that the mistakes that she makes are mistakes that we all can very easily make by focusing on the experiences directly around us and missing the bigger picture and the results and the impacts we can't see down the road for other people. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's that's one of the things with the mindfulness movement where it does seem like they're falling short, where they seem to think they're going to have this kind of grandiose impact on
Impact.
society
Right.
writ large,
And
but they're not actually focusing on the specific problems and structures that they need to change
yeah,
to actually make it more humane.
No,
right.
and some of them have been co-opted. I mean, Ron has written about Davos. I mean, that's John Kabat-Zinn visits Davos and meditates with these corporate elite and global elites, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and so talking about, the business side of things, there seem to be like multiple groups of people in the business world, but there were some people who started in business, they kind of bought into business, and then they found mindfulness, this wonderful kind of opening. It gave them the personal space to think about their values. But what was interesting is I talked to a number of like Buddhist contemplative teachers who worked with business and who would make a lot of adaptations in working with business clients, and they didn't seem to notice how it affected them. They didn't seem to think about it that much. Um, so yeah, it seemed like a huge blind spot.
Yeah. Well, I like the statement that you make. Actually, it's a question, but I hear it as a statement. You make a point. Do activists who work with oppositional forces to bring a new culture in gradually adapt to the opposition's goals and lose loyalty to their own?
Right.
Uh, I,
Also known as getting co-opted.
yeah,
Yes.
it's a rhetorical. It's a question you raise, and I see that throughout the book how you raise these questions that to me they sound like statements, but that's another issue. But the Tim Ryan, you bring up Tim Ryan. I just can't help bringing this up. He's quoted. Who's going to argue with Marines doing this? Meaning mindfulness.
Mindful fit. What is it called? Mindfulness fitness training.
Mindfulness based fitness training,
MFTD.
whatever it is. Yeah, but the fact that he says, "Who's going to argue with Marines doing this?" Well, we are. I mean,
Yeah.
I just can't believe that that's a justification because Marines are doing it, that it's all okay. I mean, to me, it's just insane.
Yep.
I'm in a real rant mood today, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. That's one of the ways I think that meditation and mindfulness became credible to the American public was saying, "Hey, look, here's this
Yeah,
like brand name organization. Here's Google. Here's this
right.
company you've heard of that's super esteemed in society.
All
If
these
they're doing it,
reputable, yeah,
then this isn't woo-woo. This isn't countercultural. This isn't some like dirty hippies on a mountain. This is, the
right.
mainstream. This is acceptable and this is legitimate. And scientists believe in this. Like so."
Yep.
And that's kind of, you had mentioned in, in your question earlier about, the branding behind it and how it oversimplifies it. And that's what happens is you have somebody who's a public figure who's kind of giving this kind of oversimplistic portrayal, and then the media picks up on it and, they repeat it, and it might even get more simple in their rendition,
Oh, yeah.
and suddenly, mindfulness is everything. And in the book there was one article that I included about the Google Search Inside Yourself program, which basically said mindfulness has become everything. It's sitting, it's walking, it's talking, it's it's going for a walk, it's
Hmm.
meditating, it's
Going
whatever
to the
you can think
bathroom.
of.
Yeah.
Yeah, well then it loses all the meaning, right? And you're kind of like, okay, well then what is it even, what's the purpose, how is this
Right.
useful? So yeah, it loses the depth, it loses it loses a lot through that process. But one of the things that I think I wanted to show with the book also is that there's also a lot of variation in the people who are promoting mindfulness.
Uh-huh.
So there are some people who have very devout Buddhist practices, and there's some people who have no knowledge of Buddhism and are really getting it second or third hand at this point, or even fourth hand. So that's one of the tricky things when you have a movement that doesn't regulate how its practices and ideas and ideologies are getting passed on, is that when people can take it and make it whatever they want, the person who's changing it has a lot of power. So there's really a wide spread of what mindfulness currently is. I mean, some of these programs don't call it mindfulness. They call it mind training or brain training, or,
Right.
they make it seem like it's not mindfulness, but if you talk to them, that's where it came from, and that's what it is. So, yeah, there's a wide spread. So
Can,
that's just
can
something.
you, I'm sorry, can you talk, following up on that, can you talk about, you interviewed some educators, and the related question is, some are Buddhists, and they try to convert, they don't think they're doing Buddhism, but they're kind of doing Buddhism in educational settings.
Yeah, so mindfulness in education is really tricky. So on one hand, if you want to be a mindful educator and go into public schools, then it's got to be a secular program. So they have to say
Right.
that the program is secular. But the roots of a lot of the programs
Right.
come from Buddhism, but then they're adapted. So one major adaptation that they made was to make the practices accessible to children. So they created lots of games and books and metaphors and stories and ways of teaching them, using toys, things like that. So that changed it. But also each individual educator, like I said, without a lot of regulation, the early people who were doing this would take whatever, spiritual practices or other educational background that they had and kind of combine it to shape their programs. So so there's a lot of, so they're not wrong in that there's secular forces that are shaping it, but a lot of them also are drawing, some of them are drawing directly from Jon Kabat-Zinn, so it's already a watered down version. But some of them are drawing, from Buddhist teachers or their own Buddhist practices, but then, changing the way that they're changing the language, they're secularizing the language in how they share it,
Yeah.
and
What I
changing
found,
the practices.
right. What I
Adapt them.
found, I couldn't believe the interviews you had with a number of these educators in the mindful school movement, because they just basically told you outright, yeah, we're taking these Buddhist practices and then kind of scaling them back and then renaming them. There's one example in the book, and this one woman is telling you how she's taken like a loving kindness practice and changed the name of it, or not even calling it mindfulness meditation, right? And the point that what struck me about that is, like, did she really think these kids wouldn't know what they were really teaching them? I think they're that stupid, or the parents themselves. I mean, did you notice anything that seemed a little contradictory there?
Yeah, so I mean, what was interesting is some of the people would follow it up and say, but the kids know what we're doing. They say we're doing meditation class.
Yeah, of course.
And what it seemed like, which is also interesting, is that the gatekeepers, so administrators and teachers, they don't seem to mind the waving of the hands. They seem to think that the programs are a great opportunity.
Yeah.
And, they say, as long as you do the hand wave, we'll do the hand wave. And then, it's all okay. And actually, what's interesting now is, being in the middle of this project on civil servants, there's a lot of interesting parallels, actually, of civil servants under the Trump administration with the mindfulness practitioners, in that, people have this amazing ability. It's a really curious, fascinating ability to just shape things for what people want to hear, but kind of keep the stuff that they want there anyway. And that's what's happening in the Trump government as well. And oftentimes, the audience doesn't seem to care that much. So yeah, it's surprising. And
Yeah, I mean, we have a friend, colleague, Candy Gunther Brown, who we'll be interviewing later when her new book comes out. But we told her about your book, by the way, and she's
thank you.
yeah. Well, one of my questions was, if a conservative legal organization read your book, they might be able to make a really strong argument about the violation of the Establishment Clause, given what you've surfaced in terms of what these people are admitting, what they're doing. It's quite remarkable.
I mean,
But
the
anyway.
separation of church and state.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. That kept me up at night. So as a researcher, I want to uphold ethical standards, and I don't want to cause harm to the people I study.
know.
And I really like the people I study. So I thought about this a lot, and in some ways, that's one reason I wanted to show the data, and I wanted to show the complexity of the data, so that I think you're right in that they could make an argument in violation of the Establishment Clause. However, if you read the book closely, you can also make the argument the other way. So it's a complicated case. So this is what happens when you have a culture that's an admixture of different sources.
Right.
So it's like you have a glass of water and it's half full. So some people can look at it and try to argue, okay, well, it's half full. And other people will look at it and say, okay, it's half empty. But the fact is, it's a really bad way of classifying it, because they're both like they're binary options for something that's a mixture of different things, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. The whole secular religious binary is problematic. But
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
one of the things that that I find, well, at some level, I don't feel it's Buddhist at all what they're doing, on one level, because using fun, interactive games, and to me, it's just like what was that one exercise they did where someone else like me or something like that? Wasn't it an exercise where you're trying to take the perspective of the other person? Do you remember that?
yeah, so what's so interesting? So this was an exercise that the teacher actually got from a Huffington Post article.
Okay.
And it was a meditation on think of somebody, just like me. So think of somebody just like me. Then think of somebody who isn't really like me, or someone who you're an acquaintance with, and then somebody you don't like.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Sounds
what's
like
interesting about that exercise is I've seen a Buddhist monk teach that exercise in
Yeah.
a
No,
Buddhist
it's
center.
it's right out of the meta. It's right out of the meta.
Yeah.
yeah, for
you
sure.
know,
But on the
you
other hand,
learn-
you could take it right out of psychology too. Perspective
Yeah.
taking. It's
developmental.
not, yeah, perspective
developmental.
taking. Right.
And that's what's so complicated about mindfulness, right? Is that it's both. I mean, it could be read as either. It could be read as both, right? So you can't decisively say it's one but not the other, because the roots could be either. So, and I think that's the conundrum, I think, of a lot of different examples of what mindfulness is.
Right. Well, maybe we'll move on to business, because that seems to be one that's a little more less ambiguous in terms of what's been going on. And I like referring to people like Richard Fernandez and others as the mindful merchants, the people who are selling mindfulness to corporations. But you make some very strong points when it comes to business in the book. So it's a little less complicated, would you say, or more obvious about how the alteration of these practices have been completely instrumentalized to be consonant with the corporate interest?
Yeah, so I think the business cases were strikingly different to me than a lot of the other cases. So business came along later.
Right.
Education, people started doing it earlier. A lot of the people that I talked to who were bringing mindfulness into schools had been meditating for years, some of them for decades already. So business, it seemed to me like there were a lot of people who it was like, the people who go to a yoga class and become a yoga instructor, where it seemed like some of them didn't have, a long-standing background, or they already like this. It was like their de facto kind of sense of the world was based on business structures.
Yeah.
It wasn't as deeply based in, an alternative reality or moral system like
Right.
Buddhism.
I know one person. I know one person in that corporate space who is a management consultant, and I know of his work from 20 years ago. And when the mindfulness craze hit, he just reinvented himself and suddenly became a corporate mindfulness teacher. I mean, this is someone who really knows where the dollars are, and so I see a lot of that in the corporate mindfulness space.
We should buy stock in his company.
And so what's interesting, another thing that I think is important to mention about my perspective is that I tried to talk to the core of the contemplative and mindfulness movement and the core organizations. And so the bias of the book is tilted towards people who have a deep practice and a long-standing tradition in it. And it spread. So I stopped collecting data in about 2015, but I really did most of the data collection around 2011 to 2012, right when it was exploding in business. But that being said, since I stopped collecting data, I've come across a lot of people who are involved in bringing it into business or have learned about, mindfulness, second, third, fourth, fifth hand. And I think that this is something. So if I was going to study the book again, I'd want to study these outer circles because these are the new transmitters and these are the people that aren't so deeply embedded in the practices. And there's a lot of misinformation where they bought hook, line, and sinker some of the things that prior generations of leaders have said. And some of them are less critical and some of them are charging a lot of money. So that's a newer development that really I didn't capture with my data in the book, but needs to be looked at.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's a follow-up study that either you and or others can do about this next generation, how it's getting watered down and transformed and becoming more commodified and so on. That's really something.
Yeah, like you mentioned in the book, the person who started the meditation app, Buddhify. You interviewed him?
Yes, I did.
And he didn't seem to have any problem with the idea that it was being commercialized, and he actually believed that he was still offering this full strength Buddhist path through his app.
It's so some of these examples of people in business are interesting because we're all three of us are coming from an academic background where I think, especially as social scientists, as a sociologist and someone who studies business organizations, we come at it and we look at the long-term repercussions of inequality. We look at how, these organizations really aren't thinking about the best interests oftentimes of their employees anymore. And we've got this, intrinsic skepticism of business. And one of the things, talking to people in the tech sector in San Francisco, that wasn't the case. There wasn't that skepticism. There was more
Wisdom 2.0.
glossy shine. Yeah, you live there, so I don't think I could live there because I think it creeped me out a little bit much. I left and I went to Nepal for a month. Yeah, so
you had the detox from Wisdom 2.0.
I felt like I did actually. I felt like I was getting sucked into it, and I felt like I really needed to just step away when I stopped talking to people.
Well, isn't there a sense of irrational exuberance?
There is. Yeah. There is, and it's this, it's this faith and in capitalism and in growth and in innovation, and it's raw and exciting for these young people in the tech scene, and I think that, that person was one of many that is like that, and I think actually. And this might be in light of the Trump era, which seems a bit of a more dark historical moment. But I mean, I think that we're in the minority in some ways of, thinking about this regularly, about, these longer term and more invasive consequences of this company and corporate culture. I think a lot of people, it doesn't bother them.
Right. And they're in a very privileged place to begin with. So, I mean, that's what affords them this opportunity to turn the Buddhist label on and off when it's convenient for them, and that's what you raise in the book. Is I think you put it, especially pointing towards John Kabat-Zinn's multivalent language is the way you put it.
Yeah. So his point was he wanted to appeal to multiple different audiences at the same time, and so he acknowledges it. So he did an article, I think around 2010 2011, where he talks about the history of developing the program, and he talks about the need for these umbrella concepts that would be vague enough that lots of people would believe in them. And I think he was affected based on the way his perspective was being received by a lot of people. So even though it didn't seem to make sense to me, it was an effective tactic for him.
Right. And especially in business, as you've been pointing out with the Wisdom 2.0 crowd and all that, it just seems like arrogance 2.0 to me. That they really think that their simplifications and adaptations. I mean, are they really that ignorant that they don't see how their own cultural context in the West has changed their perspectives, and that somehow they think that they're immune from Western cultural influences, that they don't have any inkling that their alterations may be completely detracting from the transformative potential of these practices? I mean, were you surprised by that sort of, hubris or whatever it may be?
So I guess
it's a leading question.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Yeah, it is. It is. And I'll reinterpret it in a little bit different way. And one of it is to kind of give background of another place that I started, which was talking to Tenzin Priyadarshi, who's the Buddhist chaplain at MIT. And he's a wonderful man.
No, I know him. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You do. Yeah. So, and he's was trained by the Dalai Lama. There's all this lore behind him. But I found him to be a really, good thinker. And the way that he described it to me early on, and he laughed it off, and he thought it was kind of funny. He's like, I've attended some of these events, like especially when Mind and Life did a dialogue at MIT. And he's like, but I'm really more of, a supportive critic, where I think that by being an outsider and lending critiques from the outside, that I can help them. And that's kind of where I want to come at it too. But the way he talked about it was, he did it. He expressed it through humor, and he said, Buddhism is like a tray with all of these amazing delicacies and candies, and then leave it to the Americans to pick the low-fat, sugar-free option, and then ignore all the other ones. So that's kind of, how I think about it a little bit, is like there's all of these other options, but if the only one that you've been taught is the sugar-free, fat-free one, then you can't really get mad at people for picking it up and finding it compelling, and likely, I mean, according to the people I talked to, it helped them a lot in a lot of different ways, and you can't ignore that fact either. But yeah, they're missing a lot from the canon. And what's amazing actually about this point in American history is that we have unprecedented access to teachers and resources from a lot of different traditions. So it's all there, which makes it perhaps even more glaring. But
yeah. So you also mentioned somewhere in the book, I can't remember exactly where, that the Center for Mindfulness changed its annual meeting. The topic was something on ethics. I can't remember exactly. And you attended that meeting, is that correct? You went to that meeting?
I did.
And that meeting was in part a response to some of the critiques that were emerging at that time?
It was actually, to my surprise, most of the meeting actually seemed to be raising questions like the ones that you've been asking. So it was clear to me from the meeting that multiple main organizations in this movement, so Mind and Life, Center for Mindfulness, they're all thinking about these questions that you've raised about, are we having this bigger impact? And I think they're trying to address it in their own way. Whether the impact, matters or not remains to be seen. But yeah, the conference was an effort to raise the questions about larger social impacts with their base.
With their base.
I think what struck us was that it's as if they're just coming around to ask the question, well, gee, what are our foundational ethics? Where are the ethics here?
Yeah, it took them 36 years to come up with that.
Yeah, that's one of the themes. And then finally, I was attending the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Ed for a number of years, and I would for a while I felt like a voice in the wilderness. I was raising these kind of sociological questions about, well, what's the context here, and what, looking at individualism and neoliberalism, and other people were starting to look at racism and the lack of participation among people of color and so on. So apparently, at this meeting that you went to, they invited Rhonda McGee, whom we know, and to speak about race. And I mean, it's like they're finally coming around to these issues. But we were curious about how did you see that get presented? I mean, she tried to present issues of racism. You know, how did that work, and did they fall short? Was there any kind of impact on the members?
Yeah, I mean, good question. So, yeah, so the background of the story. So Rhonda had, she was one of the main speakers of the conference. She had a good amount of time, and what she actually did was incredibly courageous. Was she hit it head on, and she showed a video of Eric Garner dying.
Yeah.
So this is deep suffering, and throughout it, she very carefully made sure that before the video and after the video, she was embedding the video in the practices she knew everybody shared. So, settling into a mindful state, focusing on your breath, focusing on your reactions to watching the video, which was incredibly painful to watch for her and for all of us. So it was a really powerful moment. I mean, Rhonda captured that room. So here you have a group of mostly white people who've never really deeply thought about race ever. And she hits them with it head on. In some ways, it was like teaching a college course. Like it was kind of like teaching an intro college course, like what we do in our sociology classes. But she was very generous with everyone. And I think that they really appreciated the opening for them because it came as a shock, but it came as like, oh, wow, we really need to care about this. That being said, based on the questions, it was clear that people had a wide array of backgrounds, and most of them were not familiar with how to talk about race. They'd really, they had a lot to learn. But for them, I think it was like an aha moment. It was a wake-up call that this was something that they needed to pay attention to. And so Rhonda gave her talk, they did a Q&A, and then they did a breakout group afterward, which I attended, which was one of the more popular breakout groups at the conference. There were a lot of people, and I think people were really earnestly trying to grapple with, like, how do we bring this in? And what was interesting to me is I think that I'm probably more similar to you two, where my initial reaction as a sociologist would be, okay, like, let's deal with this, like let's find a way to bring this content into our curriculum, or let's like hire some new people with some outside perspectives. But there was a wide range of opinions, and there were some people who wanted to sit with it more, and draw on that more introverted, inward-looking side. So you've got these tensions. And that's where, I don't know where it's going to go. It seems like Rhonda's become a really influential leader at Mind and Life and with the Center for Mindfulness. And I think Rhonda's wonderful. I have, the deepest regard for her. I think she's very courageous. And it was the first time I'd ever seen anybody tackle race head on in the movement.
Yeah, which is kind of pathetic, at least it's a start.
And actually, I ended up writing a book chapter about the event recently. And one of the things about it is I don't think it would have been possible to do it without the Black Lives Matters movement behind her, and public consciousness already starting to change.
And you mentioned Chapman Walsh also was part of that meeting. And if I'm correct, that there was some discussion about the direction for Mind and Life Institute, and you bring up that they were moving into some sort of like leadership, mindful leadership initiative. But at the same time, she's saying that Mind and Life should avoid advocacy. I find that kind of contradictory. That Mind and Life is purely a research operation. At the same time, they seem to be doing a lot of advocacy of mindfulness.
Yeah, so Mind and Life's been going through a lot of changes, and I can't say I'm up to date with where they're at. most of my interviews I did in 2012, like I told you. I followed up with a few people after the AEI event, but at that point they had a marketing director who blocked me out. And whereas Adam had like he actually opened the archives, so Adam Engel gave me full access to the Mind Life archives when he was leading the organization. But then the next group of leaders were much more secretive, and I couldn't get in except for people who would give me confidential, behind the scenes
Yeah,
interviews.
off the record. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can't, claim to know. I don't have a privileged position on any of it
Right.
that happened after. But I do have to say that I was caught by surprise. I know they were making a big effort, so I know that they knew some of the older guard of the organization, like the older scientists who'd been involved a long time, were disgruntled, and
Yeah, I
so
know
they'd
one
done a
of.
series of interviews.
Yeah, I
And
know. I
so
know one of them that actually emailed me about a year or two ago, complaining about this new direction of Mind and Life Institute in Europe. Well, this program, the program you mentioned, is the Academy for Contemplative and Ethical Leadership, and they turned to Professor Bill George from the Harvard Business School to be one of their key, I guess, leaders in that initiative, which I find just ridiculous. You know the story about Bill George and David Loy, don't you?
no, I don't.
Well, David Loy, this is way back in 2013, I think, maybe 2012. He wrote an open letter to Bill George, questioning how his mindfulness practice had influenced his decision making since he sits on the corporate boards of Goldman Sachs and a few other Novartis. I can't remember the other companies, but pretty bad socially responsible corporations that are, cause of the 2008 financial meltdown and so forth. And he refused. He didn't answer David. He tried several times, and there was no response. But I found that to be almost like a joke for them to have him leading the movement. Anyway, that's just my opinion. But
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I interpret it was it seemed to me like a continuation of the choices they'd already made, to privileged elites,
yeah, very
focus
privileged.
on training, future PhDs and business leaders, and not really learning from, I think, some of the shortcomings they were trying to address about, well, why did we miss why did we take some missteps and end up somewhere we didn't want to go? Because we weren't including people, who have less resources, who can't afford, these fancy teachers or programs and traveling all over the place to attend them. And so, I mean, I think that to me, it was kind of an indicator of like, on one hand, they were trying to take a sociological perspective, but they kind of missed
No,
the larger
no,
critiques.
they
Right.
want to leave things as they are, basically.
Yeah, and that was why Rhonda's talk was actually so refreshing, I think, in saying we need to teach about racism in
Yes,
mindfulness
disruptive.
classes.
That's disruptive. Yeah, and you
It
also
is, and he was
you also
really
mentioned you
effective.
interviewed George Mumford, who is also confided with you about.
So I didn't interview George, but I
Oh,
bumped into him at a bunch of conferences.
I worked with George Mumford when I was working with a Brooklyn high school football team, teaching them mindfulness meditation. He was helpful to me. He consulted with me. He was coming down to Brooklyn and leading a meditation group here. So
Yeah, he's lovely. His wife Edie is also wonderful. And yeah, so I mean, I think one of the striking things. So George also talked about race at that conference, and I think it was the first time he'd publicly talked about it as well. Um,
but he mentioned
which
that he felt people didn't come up to him and talk to him as much, even in
yeah,
these mindfulness conferences.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the race problems in the mindfulness movement are,
yep,
symptomatic of the problems in our larger society, where
Yeah.
white people largely spend time with white people and don't feel comfortable talking about race. And they want to act as if we're in this, colorblind society, which we're not. And we treat people differently, even if it's subconscious, So I think that, there's a lot of room for growth in that direction.
And you
And
did a
George and
survey.
Rhonda have been.
You did a survey, didn't you? And found the demographic breakdown on. Can you say something about that survey you did?
On the
Oh,
elites, was it on
so
the?
yeah, so I didn't do a survey, but I did code my qualitative data just to get a sense of who I'd been talking to.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And
Yeah, so out of the people who I did interviews with, and this was the leaders in particular, I think I included in the book. So they were mostly white, 85% white, and only 3% Black people and 3% Hispanic people. So, you could count on one hand, the Black people in the movement
and
or
that's the
the Hispanic.
culture of privilege that you basically
Yeah.
have discovered.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I think the culture of privilege is changing globally, where there's, multi-ethnic and, racial people from all over the world that are in the new order, the new elite. But at the same time, there's white privilege in all the dominant organizations and institutions.
That's also, as a sociologist, you're probably familiar with the critique of the buzzword diversity, which is that you can have an elite that's now more diverse, but guess what? There's still elite. In other words, it doesn't necessarily transform the social structures that are inequitable or that are contributing to inequality.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that one of the contributions of the book I wanted to point out was I wanted to kind of show all the more micro mechanisms through which privilege operates that most people don't see, so that once they read it, that hopefully, it would become visible and it could be something that they could deal with.
Have you had any response from some of the people in the book that you interviewed or in the movement?
It's just trickling in now. So the book came out in October, and I sent you some of the earliest copies. I know in October they only sent out copies, I think, to people I'd listed or people the publisher wanted to send them to. So people are just starting to read them. But Rhonda McGee actually did call me, and she was really enthusiastic. She said she's going to read it closely and use it to help improve her programming and perspective and involvement. So that was really heartening to hear. I know that other people have bought the book, some people who, might be seen in a more critical light, but I haven't heard back from folks. I think that it's been well received among scholars so far
Oh, that's
in
good.
sociology. Yeah. So yeah, but it's still early. I think it takes more time.
It does take time. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'd like to read a short sentence from the conclusion chapter. I think this sums it up pretty good. You say, for a movement inspired and motivated by democratic aspirations, progressive politics such as reducing consumption and material inequality, and spiritual liberation for all, it is striking how the contemplative base was composed of such a privileged, seemingly homogeneous group of people. To me, that's quite powerful. Anyway, so stepping back, do you see the mindfulness movement basically as a souped-up self-help movement?
I think so. I think that as it stands, most of their energies have been focused on developing programs and thinking about curriculum on the cushion.
And
And I
individual
think that
individual level too.
individual development, yeah, and there's group learning that goes on in
Yeah,
those
sure.
contexts, but yeah, it's focused more on immediate experiences. So I think that if they want to focus more on changing society and changing institutions, then in addition they need to think about how to more directly deal with those issues. And and speaking of Rhonda, she's one of the only people I think who's really seriously trying to think about how to bring in some of the social problems content into their curriculum. I think that would be a step in the right direction. But also recognizing that, in working with corporate leaders, it's not just enough to meditate and then, transform, the way they think about things so they might be more attuned to their personal values, but really helping facilitate deeper structural change and guiding them in those directions as well. But that's going to come at a cost with pushback from boards and from the larger, the larger institutions that they're in. So it's not going to be easy. But if
because then
that's really what they're committed to, they have to try it.
Well, then you're out of the consensus-based approach to the movement that you mentioned into more of a confrontational or oppositional approach at that point. If your curriculum is going to call into question some of the fundamental ethos of, let's say, profit-making enterprises. So you have a chapter that's called Changing Individuals or Changing Institutions, and I think that you really hit it hard right there. The thing that troubles us is that the grandiosity of the movement, that where they overpromise and basically saying, it's that everyone should practice mindfulness, as if it's the magical solution to world peace, And then they qualify it. They say, well, we hope that this change will come about, or, we kind of think it might. And it's a lot of big talk, I think. But when you ask them, okay, what actually changed in a systemic level or at the structural level, they came up empty-handed when you asked them for those kinds of outcomes.
I did. I sought out quantitative data from companies too, and no one was willing to share it with me. So yeah, I think it remains to be seen. I think there's a desperate need for more research on these larger impacts. But yeah, to date, I haven't seen anything that would convince me that they are having these larger impacts. There was another, so one case in which they could have more of an impact is if you had a really strong leader of an organization that was able to integrate it into all the levels of the organization, and willing to put resources behind it, and willing to make larger structural changes.
Well, wasn't Shapiro someone like that in Monsanto?
So they started by offering classes to the C-suite and by offering other options, but he didn't go so far as to raise wages or offer other benefits or
call into question their products that they were developing.
Exactly right. So those are the things that I think in a more holistic way you need to put on the table to make it seem more aligned with their values, or the underlying implicit values that were there before, and the ones that I think they're trying to make more explicit now, but I think it does remain to be seen. But yeah, so I don't know that much about the Aetna case. It seems like the CEO did raise minimum wage there, but then I think they're going to go through an IPO or something, or there's a merger or something coming up where it's unclear whether the gains that they actually made will be kept. So that's another challenge with business is you can make strides under a certain leader, a rare leader that would take those kinds of strides. But then the question is, will the next leader just repeal it all when the bigger system is stacked against you? So it's not hopeful in business.
No, because the bottom line is the bottom line.
Yeah, you don't screw with Wall Street. Anyway, well, Jamie, I think it was a great conversation, and boy, we covered a lot of ground, and I wish you luck on the book and your next book. I can't wait to see it. I think that's going to really do well.
No, thank you so much. It was fun talking with you both. Thanks so much for reading the book and for sharing it.
You're very welcome. We really learned a lot from you and appreciate your book, and wish you well and the book.
Thank you.
Jaime Kucinskas is assistant professor of sociology at Hamilton College. Her research interests spans sociology of religion, social movements, organizational and cultural change, and inequality. Her work has centered on how people mobilize for, as well as resist change within and across organizations and fields. She also studies spiritual experiences across different settings. She is the author of The Mindful Elite, Mobilizing from the Inside Out, published by Oxford University Press, 2019. And she has published in journals such as the American Journal of Sociology, the Journal of the Scientific Study of Religion, and Sociology of Religion. I am Ron Purser, and this is the Mindful Cranks podcast. Please visit our Facebook and Twitter pages, and we'll see you next time in episode 15.